Welcome everyone to Crushing Comics. We are here today to talk about X-Men and in particular continuing our reread, our epic X-Men reread of classic Claremont X-Men. So we're going to be talking about Uncanny X-Men 94 and 95, as well as some backup stories from classic X-Men 2, 3, 5, and 10 today. While it sounds like that should only involve spoilers for these classic issues, we are definitely going to be reevaluating them in the light of Jonathan Hickman's House of X, Powers of X, and his Dawn of X. So while we'll try to not spoil anything that's brand new without a disclaimer, we are going to be talking about some new comic books as well. So with that out of the way, let me welcome my two favorite friends and mutants from around the world to talk to. Tyler and Fariha, how are you this fine day?
I'm good. It's Friday evening, so that's the end of a long week of work at home. So, I'm happy to be here to talk about some things that I really like.
Yes. Fariha, how are things with you? Are you and the cat holding up and you're quarantined together?
Yes. So, my cat is actually my co-host. She's sitting right here. She's actually sleeping. I need to wake her up. But, she's just here listening to me talk about X-Men. And I have a lot of thoughts today. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about it. This is my first time reading it. I know this is your 8th and 9th and 100th time. For me, this is my first time reading this. So I have thoughts. I have lots of thoughts.
Well, I am so excited about that.
Ready to share. Yeah, I had to actually think a long time in terms of how to present all the thoughts that I have about this. So I don't know, maybe I'll be rambling a lot, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Okay, wow. Well, just to remind everybody, so Fariha just mentioned that Tyler and I have read a lot of X-Men in our time, and some of these issues you're reading today, I have so many copies of in my house. I was trying to figure out how many. It's a number. But Fariha has never read any classic Claremont. So we're approaching this not from a place of encyclopedic knowledge where we're going to catch every single reference. We're kind of approaching it from a little bit of a spot of what is it like to introduce one of our good friends to something that we love? And does that thing that we love hold up after all these years? So, issues 94 and 95 form one stories. The X-Men battle Count Nefario almost by accident as they get summoned since the Avengers are busy and he's threatening the world to be held as nuclear hostages until each country will pay him according to their ability to pay, which seems very egalitarian to me. But why don't we start out with Fariha's first impressions before we dive too much into the specifics of these two stories that work as one?
So my one question, I kind of mentioned it in the chat, that is what is Avengers doing that they cannot come when there is a nuclear threat of this level? What are they doing, and why I'm not reading that story? But that's just a joke. But the second thing is, I was actually thinking it more in terms of because I started, I read so many of the modern X-Men stuff, and then especially with the Hickman X-Men, that kind of brought us together again, and how it changed the status quo. Going back to read this story kind of felt strange after all of that, because it almost to me felt we have all met each other as adults, over last 3 years, which we mentioned before. So it's almost to me felt now I'm doing a time machine, taking you guys back in the time machine as my time as a kid and how I'm growing up, which begs the question, does that need to happen? Why can't I just tell you that, little interesting tidbits? So I don't know, I'm having to kind of constantly remind myself, okay, this all happened before. And I just having to constantly remind myself that even though maybe a lot of things have changed, just take it as it is. But for some reason, it's not sitting well with me. I'm just who cares? This doesn't mean anything anymore. The mansion, we have already seen the mansion is completely destroyed now. They don't live here. None of this matter. So it just, I don't know. It's been difficult. It's been difficult. But, I'm just glad that at least we're doing this. So you guys will be probably able to tell me some things that I missed and then make it make it more interesting than what my read through has been.
Well, I think there's a really interesting aspect to that, because I think you have to ask yourself about that a lot while reading old comics. Of course, you can just love them for the joy of them, but sometimes you ask, like, is any of this going to be referenced anymore? Not even referenced, because of course in DC that wouldn't happen. But you could also ask yourself, has a lot of this been superseded with better modern stories, right? And I definitely feel that way sometimes when I'm reading a lot of solo characters, where I'm like, this is nice and all, and I do really like Bronze Age comics, but there's so many more definitive modern runs. Is there even really a point to reading this anymore? I think specifically when Oh, go ahead, Fariha.
No. I was just kind of say that I've been thinking about it from Ed Brubaker's Captain America
That's
run.
the exact thing I thought of when I said that.
Right. Because the thing is, as you can see, they're right over there, all of them. But it's just, I don't know. This is a podcast. You can't see that. Sorry. But I was saying that.
Imagine, picture it.
Picture it.
Surrounded by every Jonathan Hickman and Ed Brubaker hardcover and a perimeter around her shining hair.
Exactly. I was thinking about it, like how when Brubaker wrote his run, even though Captain America has been around since 1940s, he actually kind of talks about those old war stories within the context of his own stories, so that it's different. You're picking up different context from that time, and then how it's kind of matches with the current time. And I don't know whether Hickman did do that or didn't do that, or did just enough that none of this now matters anymore. So that's kind of one of the reasons I was having a hard time digesting these stories.
Well, I mean, the relationship still matters. The friendship that developed throughout this entire run, and the characterizations of certain characters, I think it plays a really important role in the sense that it defines the X-Men as family, and it doesn't matter whether your family is living in a mansion or on an island. That definition, that the interpersonal relationship, I think matters a lot. And I think not just Hickman, but a lot of writers that are on docs right now do reference pretty heavily to some of these characterizations and relationships that have been is developed pretty much primarily by Claremont.
Yeah, I think Tyler
completely agree on that.
Tyler got to the heart of where I was going with that, which is that unlike if you're reading Avengers or something where maybe one of the stories gets relevant because a plot hook is similar, you will find with this Claremont X-Men material that some of these stories are relevant because of one character beat that happened in them that has become permanent, and we see that in some of the character beats here. I mean, we get the beginning of Cyclops versus Wolverine. We get the beginning of Colossus kind of acting as everybody's brother because he's so full of compassion. Even this early in Claremont's run, where a lot of the characterizations are, we could say, inconsistent now with the benefit of 45 years of history. They're not inconsistent. They're just Claremont figuring it out at the time. But even with that, the seeds of it are kind of borne out here. So I think X-Men is unique in almost any comic continuity of almost any ongoing comic, that you will actually find stuff in the run from 1975 to 1981 or 1991 that resonates still. And that would be a fun game to play, right? As we're continuing to read these, to pick out what happened in this story that actually is still relevant to today. But before we can even get into all that, we start the story with this giant pile of X-Men, right? We ended giant-sized X-Men with this huge mound of characters, everybody except for Beast. Immediately, Sunfire is like, see ya. He calls them an idealistic pack of fools, which could be the subtitle of X-Men on many runs, right? X-Men, that idealistic pack of fools. Banshee tries to tag out of the team by saying he's too old and, I quote, barely literate, which I think is an interesting take on Banshee to see how he kind of like evolves over time from being this like old beat cop turned criminal who can barely read. Whereas Storm is merely intrigued by the idea of the X-Men. Do you kind of believe this forming? Do you think and then of course all the old X-Men leave except for Cyclops, who can't tear himself away. Do you kind of buy this? Does it shake out in the way you think it could or should, or do you think this is just editorial telling Claremont sweep away half of the characters?
To me, it felt like that because we talked about it before. Is like the old X-Men were not very popular at this time, and then there needed to be some rehauling of everything, and it almost felt like that. It's just like, see ya, didn't want to be ya, and then just go. I was actually kind of thinking more in terms of like how there was like this one YouTube channel called Honest Trailer. So they did the Honest Trailer for 1990s X-Men animated series. And they talked about it, and it kind of stuck with me. It's like for a piece of media, like an IP that tries to overcome stereotype, they do so much rely on a stereotype. Like every character that talks over here, they talk in stereotype here. Like, the band talk about Banshee, or talk about who is that one that left? Just said see ya.
Sunfire. He's like, this samurai.
Sunfire. Yeah, this samurai is out of here. It felt like everyone speaks in so much stereotype. I mean, I kind of loved it. I was like, we have to make sure that people understand these are not white people. Constantly remind.
Wow.
We have to constantly remind people. Or like, even if they're white but they're not American, then we have to remind them where they're from. So it just felt really strange wordings at times. I was like, ugh.
To me, that's like part of the charm of it, because like a lot of other comics would have that same level of stereotype to make the cast seem different, but it is like this very white, homogenous cast. But at least in X-Men, they're using the stereotypes and the people are actually different. It's like if you have Hawkeye being a tough guy to Cap versus, the Wasp versus, like, how different is that cast from each other compared to the X-Men cast? It's probably the most geographically and probably also ethnically diverse cast in comic books at this point in 1975.
But like, I mean, if we talk about the art itself, right? If you look at the first page, like, I think it's brilliant, right?
Oh, that's so beautiful.
That he drew, he construct a view such that you can see everybody's face using a mirror. I was like, I have to admit, the first time I read this, I did not notice the mirror, like the very, very first time I read it. So I was like, when I reread it and starts to, and that's when I started to appreciate more into the artistry of every artist, and not just how they draw faces or body, and that's when I started noticing things like that. And I mean, I just thought this is like really brilliant.
And also I would say that I don't think of Cockrum as somebody who draws really real to life faces as much, maybe because when Cockrum comes back after John Byrne, he has a very smooth way of drawing everybody that's like a little bit softer, maybe. I don't know. It could be my imagination. We'll see if we get there. But on this page, he draws some really very true to life sort of faces, especially Colossus, especially Jean. And then how weird and demonic Nightcrawler looks jumps out at me much more. Whereas I think over time, people start to draw Kurt more as just a blue human. But at the beginning, Claremont or Cockrum, who let's not forget was, created the visual of Nightcrawler, is still drawing him with this very demonic visage. He's not just a blue dude. He actually has very different facial features and facial structure and these giant eyes and this pointy chin,
Yeah.
No, I agree. So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, I agree with that because, I was actually a little bit taken aback by the first page just because my eye just drew to Nightcrawler right away.
Yes.
And then I was like, ugh. Sorry, I didn't mean to, but you know what I mean? It was like, what is this? And I'm used to seeing him more like a blue dude, like, now. So if you didn't kind of put that in context, I'm like, oh, this was a bad art. But it kind of makes sense that, when initially he was designed to look a little bit more non-human.
Yeah. But I mean, Cockrum also loved his eyebrows. I mean, look at the strong brows on some of these characters.
It's very true.
Hold on. Now I'm going to look at. Ooh, yeah, you are right. Wow. Yeah. People look at Professor X's eyebrows.
Oh, the eyebrows in Professor X. I love. I mean, we'll get to the next issue, but there's one giant like half-page splash that's just all eyebrows. They're like the whole feature. So look, we get this introduction. All of the classic team leaves except for Cyclops, who gives Jean a passionate kiss goodbye. Sunfire leaves, and we're left with our famous core of remaining X-Men. They go deep into a training montage, during which a lot of other things happen, and we'll talk about those classic X-Men issues at the end of this episode, because there are some really interesting stuff to talk about in them. The only other thing that really happens here is, in a very 60s, 70s Silver and Bronze Age way, we get a somewhat ridiculous villain who has huge aspirations and not a lot of why behind them, which is Count Nefario. He used to be with the Magia, who aren't they effectively the mob? He's got the Annie-Men, who are just these like animal hybridy villains. They kind of almost feel high evolutionary sort of, but I looked into it and they'd been previously appearing in Daredevil of all places. And Claremont actually adds a female member, of course he does, the Dragonfly lady. And so they've taken on this base, which is a real NORAD base. I don't know that it's really called Valhalla, but there is a real NORAD base in Cheyenne Mountain in the real world. And he holds the world ransom. And so the army calls the Avengers, because the Avengers are cops and the Fantastic Four are not. So of course they call the Avengers. That's a joke. And Beast, who's on the Avengers at this time, says, hey, we're not home. Can you X-Men handle it? Fariha asked, where were the Avengers at this point? They were in a story where they were fighting the Zodiac, who had a starship, but it was also in New York. I don't know. But they were busy fighting the Zodiac is the answer to your question. So Beast sends his old team, who he's never met before, on this mission to save the entire world. I mean, is there anybody else that could be on call? Avengers, Fantastic Four, I guess there's nobody else to send in the Marvel Universe at this point.
Yeah. I don't think there is at that time.
No, there isn't. But the thing is, like, I think that what really stand out is like Beast calls is like, oh, we need you guys to go, and then he's like, oh, who are these people? It's like these are X-Men, and it's like, oh, if you say so. Anyway, we need people to be sent over here. I thought that was hilarious. That to me pretty funny. Like it's just like, hey, who are these people?
Who are you? And Beast also looks really strange here to me.
And he's actually let me editorialize here for a second. So in the classic X-Men issues, and you have to remember that we are advising you to read those as you read along. That's what we're doing. Classic X-Men not only printed backups with these X-Men stories when it reprinted them, it actually made some extra pages in the middle of stories, and it actually also made some art and copy changes, or in Claremont's view, corrections. So there are some corrections that it made to this issue, and I looked at the side-by-side in the classic X-Men omnibus, and one of them is that Beast has been subtly redrawn to match how he looks in modern comics. Also, we get Storm's dialogue changes, because Storm grows to have this very royal, regal way of speaking. She very rarely uses contractions, and Claremont didn't have that on lock at the beginning. So at the beginning, she does sometimes speak in that way, but Classic X-Men kind of revised it. So there's no way to read that Classic X-Men version of it straight through, but the excerpted extra pages are in the Classic X-Men omnibus, and they are also on, some of them are in the copies that are on Marvel Unlimited.
Yeah, so I think this one is in Marvel Unlimited. So the new version, and the so-called revised version was actually the first version I read, because
you read it in Classic X-Men.
Correct, because at that time there is no trade paperbacks, there's no Marvel Unlimited, and so the only way I could collect and read back issues was to buy Classic X-Men. And I still remember that my very first Classic X-Men issue is the arcade issue. And then I went back and, whenever my local comic shop has a sale or something, I would buy some of these Classic X-Men. I was still a student then, so saving money and buying up all those back issues until I have the entire run. So it was so when I first read the original issue, which was probably a couple of years ago in the Omnibus Volume 1, I was like,
what happened here?
I don't remember the story being that choppy or that, like the voices were that off. So, and then, and finally figure out that, because there were changes to the issue itself that Claremont made after the fact.
Yeah. So Claremont, I think
Unlimited now. So in Marvel Unlimited
yes.
now,
the Classic X-Men, the Classic X-Men number 2. If you go to Classic X-Men and you read and you read second issue, that one is the one that has all the additional pages and changes to the dialogue and panels.
But unlike George Lucas, Marvel has not replaced the original versions with the remasters.
Right. But no, I was just saying that, in this, at least in this issue, Beast looks no different than Nightcrawler. Like, it looks very similar. They look very similar. That's what I was going to say. Like, it's just like two blue dudes.
I mean, also at that point in time, right? The X-Men is still not or mutants in general is still not a dirty word, right? So when they showed up and tried to help the guards that were the soldiers that were there, they made a comment, but they still will not be like, oh no, you're not welcome here. We don't welcome your help.
Yeah, it was much more like mutants, huh? Like it wasn't as discriminatory.
No, I mean, I don't know which version I read. It's like, the soldier pretty much said, I knew that your muties gonna show up. No, it's still very bad. It's still like they're still being treated like, not very.
No, they were not treated as heroes for sure.
Well, so to go to the text, he says, figures. I might have known I might have known you muties would show up with Nefario around, which maybe is a dig at the fact that Nefario has these mutant, animal men, and the mutants are no different than animals, which carries a lot of loaded historical commentary with it in terms of comparing a minority to nothing more than animals. So even though they're welcome to participate and not attacked, I think Fariha's got a great point here where this is not what acceptance looks like either.
No, this is not, and it's from a 3-star general. You know how I know he's a 3-star? It's on his helmet. It's on his helmet. A 3-star general just called a bunch of people muties, and he's pretty much letting them in on this mission because he thinks that they're gonna die and he's not gonna waste his own soldier. That is not acceptance. People do not accept this as acceptance.
So just a couple of other things, because the issue pretty much ends after that, right? They're in the Blackbird and they get shot down, pretty much is what happens after that. Yep. But there's a couple of other things to note before we move on to number 95. There's the first of a long-running Claremont gag of having the captions mock Cyclops. So Cyclops is sitting there like thinking about what he's going to do, and he's like, games, some people like them, some don't, not Cyclops. And we'll get to the iconic mocking of Cyclops in captions pretty shortly. And then the other thing is that in the Classic X-Men insert into this, which is of course not part of the regular issue, we actually get Maura McTaggart 2 issues before she actually gets introduced, basically, getting a call from the X-Men in her rolling fields of Scotland. So let's move.
And Rain too.
Yeah, and Rain, Wolfsbane, who is her charge, which we actually don't get introduced to until New Mutants graphic novel, but theoretically would be there already, and so Claremont goes back, and that's why it's called a retcon, because it's retroactive continuity. Okay, so we're going to move on with one more comment to 95. The comment is that as the Blackbird gets shot down here, and we think the X-Men are in peril, Claremont refers to the dying Blackbird as becoming a phoenix, because Claremont's got his tropes that he loves, and he's already seeding an ideas of a Phoenix 6 issues before it happens. Let's move on to Uncanny.
Oh, before we move on, sorry.
Sure.
Before we move on, can we also talk about that Professor X just constantly beaming into people's head all the time? Like, instead of just calling, he's just like, Cyclops, meet me in my office. And then he's always in people, but then he was also super shocked when the older X-Men says we are leaving. He was like, huh? I'm like, wait, so what's... Are you in on this or are you not? What's your deal? And then, and also, we were going to talk about later in the read it's like, shouldn't you know all of this? Anyway, I was just laughing about it. He's just constantly just beaming into people's head. It's like, hey, come here. Hey, do this. Just do an intercom system, man. You have the danger room. Just do that.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about Professor X, how passive aggressive was he when he was trying to convince Banshee? He's like, oh, you have strands of white in your hair. What about me? I
thought that was funny. That was pretty funny.
You don't have any hair. What are you talking about?
Well, no, that's what he was talking about. He was talking about you have as many gray hair as I do, which is none, right?
None.
So, because I'm bald.
I know.
So I was like,
But
but it was pretty passive aggressive, right?
Can you help but understand the modern characterization of Xavier as this kind of terrible person? Because even though here he's been written just as this firm mentor figure, in retrospect he's actually pretty terrible. It kind of just flows. It would be much harder to make him out to be caring than it would be to make him out to be terrible,
I feel my idea of Professor X completely was shaped by Patrick Stewart, and it's very difficult to not like Patrick Stewart, right? But then as you read more of the stories, you're like, oh, the movie really brainwashed you. That's not true Professor X. And this is kind of continues on from here too.
And there's one more tradition. Oh, well, I wouldn't say tradition, but one more thing that Claremont likes to do is he loves big words.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, and for me, I got one new big word here that I've never encountered before. It's coruscation.
Oh, I actually periodically have to look that one up because I do forget sometimes what it means.
Yeah. I was like,
what does it mean? What does it mean? Here's the thing, I did not notice that. It's maybe because I don't actually read comics in that word for word, it's just all just ideas just beaming up in my head along with the picture. So I did not notice that.
Well, in this context, it means glitter or sparkle.
Yeah, something that's coruscating is kind of flashes of light or cascade of light. Although it can also mean a sudden strike of something, a coruscation. Yeah. But it's derived from light, which is in Star Wars, the planet or the big city is called Coruscant, right? Because it's a city. Okay, so now we're really moving on to number 95 here. Yep. And number 5, it's pretty much all action, right? It starts with them falling out of the sky after having been shot down. We get a very kind of Bronze Age, everybody gets to show their power one time to help them get down to the ground and remind us who they are. They burst into the Nefaria's mountain, and the action's actually pretty compressed here. They break into the mountain, and all of a sudden the problem becomes that Nefaria is getting away. They're like, what about all the other stuff? And Professor Xavier says, no, I psychically scanned the computer system, which we'll come back to. And everything's fine. Chase that jet. So, this is very Bronze Age, right? One story kind of in a dreamlike fashion turns into a totally different story, and the things that matter before don't matter as much now. But Fariha, we'll start with you because you're our new reader here. Was there anything interesting, shocking, or awful about the second half of the story in Uncanny X-Men 95?
So even I knew that Nightcrawler's power doesn't work that way, because it's Nightcrawler, get in there. I'm like, no, he can't. He never seen that thing before.
Get in the mountain.
I knew that. I was like, no, it's not going to work. Yeah, get in the mountain. It's like, no, he can't. He never seen that before. And I was expecting him to say that. And he's like, nope. Oh, what did he say? Is it as good as done, Cyclops? Yeah. I'm like, no.
No, what about the part where Cyclops says, oh, Nightcrawler, you can teleport yourself onto the ground?
Yeah, onto the teleportation.
And in midair, he's like, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
That was also kind of laughing at that. I'm like, why is everyone talking as if like they're just standing
They're just like
on the ground?
standing in the air, and
they're all falling, and then they're talking, and then also like the timing doesn't add up. It's like you cannot talk that fast with that timing. So.
Maybe they have achieved like terminal velocity. So they to them they are like not moving at all. Everyone is stationary.
I don't know. I mean, it's super nitpicky, right? It's like eye roll worthy nitpicky. Yeah. I mean, it's like, okay, it's for kids, and it's just like you shouldn't be caring about that. But I couldn't help but laugh. I'm like, oh. And then also like Proudster and Wolverine is having like a whole man off, or like whose is bigger constantly, that I was rolling my eyes nonstop. And I think we kind of mentioned it. It's like, I mean, we're going to talk about he passes away in this one, but my God, that man, he just constantly yells at everyone in stereotype, and it was like, please stop. It was very insulting. I'm sorry. It's like, yeah, what if some white person tells you names because of your Native American origin? How's that gonna sound? He calls Banshee Shamrock. I was like, what? No, stop.
Well, he also calls he also keep calling Cyclops One Eye.
Yeah, but then that's more of an individual rather than a nationalistic thing, if you know what I mean. I'm all for it if you're calling people blue skin. I don't know.
What? Calling Banshee Screamer?
Yeah, Screamer. Call that.
Scream Boy.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're just calling people's nationality out left, right, and center. I was like, once again, we have to remind who's from where. That's why. Shamrock. Oh.
Well, I think that there's two big topics teased out by that kind of amusing passage, and they're probably the two big things to talk about in this issue. One is Thunderbird in general, and also how Claremont kind of goes back and tries to repair that over the years, especially in some of these classic X-Men issues. But then the other one, and we could talk about this first, is just that we don't know how all these powers work yet, because they're brand new characters. This is their third appearance. Claremont devotes a whole page of the classic X-Men rewrite to explaining why Nightcrawler should be able to teleport into the mountain, because he's clearly mortified years later by the fact that he broke one of his fundamental rules of Nightcrawler in the beginning. But even telling Nightcrawler teleport these other people out of the air, his major complaint is the velocity issue. But really, it takes 40 or 50 issues before he can reliably teleport other people and not be near death. So there's plenty of rules kind of broken here. Storm creates a flash flood in the middle of the station, not just rain, but a flood. And not long from now, Claremont will start to really make excuses for there's just enough air in the shuttle for there to be an atmosphere to Storm to, but nope, not here. Storm caused the flash flood, So he's definitely taking some time to get a handle on how some of their powers work. And of course, Colossus, who's been written as almost totally invulnerable just because he's still here. I don't know that we would drop Colossus out of a plane. Well, I guess that still happens in modern comics. But I just thought it was funny. I mean, I feel in a modern comic, we would have dropped Wolverine. They would have been let Wolverine fall. He'll be fine. Colossus, power down. Storm will get you.
Yeah.
And then also, I was also remembering that how Wolverine is supposed to be super heavy because of his skeleton.
Right.
And then this year, he was just being carried around like nobody's business. People were just having no problem carrying him around. I also want to mention, though, it's what is this facility where they have very weird gas running through the pipes? I mean, this is Fariha's engineering corners. That should not happen. You cannot just have gas that can affect people.
It should, and it's anesthesia gas. Let's just open up the pipe with the anesthesia gas that helps everybody sleep at night. Why is it?
It doesn't work like that. The amount of compressor you need, the system you will need for that, no one will design it like that. So it's just what is this? But it made me laugh, and that was good.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of sort of a trademark of of early Claremont.
Oh yeah.
Because I think you have to remember that this is probably one of his first writing assignment, like on a full-time basis, right? I think he did some small one-time stories here and there. Am I right, Peter?
I believe so. I will fact check that while you continue to chat.
Yeah. So I think, he is not only learning about the characters or defining the characters, he's also learning about his own writing skills. So, and you can see that he will improve tremendously when the next artist join him. I think those two work very well together.
Yeah,
John
To
Byrne.
be honest, though, I'm just saying that. To be honest, like I'm not like making fun of I'm not criticizing his writing, because it's like it's also very much like Brown, like that era comic. Like it's just simple things, like just for mostly for kids. So it's just like very simple things, so you don't have to overthink anything. Like it's like now we're all like cynic weirdos that we're like, oh, that's not gonna work. But come on, I shouldn't be saying that.
but it's really, so first of all, he had written some scattered singles for Marvels before this, but he'd not really had like a run necessarily. But he'd written enough that I think people who read Marvel would have been like, oh, Claremont, like he had more than an issue or two.
Okay.
So the other thing though is Fariha, it's funny that you say that, because he turns into the most complex writer, and as Tyler said, it's very much linked to the artists, right? So he's got this original run with Cockrum, then we'll be with Byrne for a while, and you'll see his writing just changes. Byrne forces Claremont to write differently, and then post Byrne, when Cockrum comes back, he writes differently, and this X-Men run is blessed by big swaths of artists, and they're all pretty talented. And I'm very interested to see your reaction, because to me, rereading it the last time I've reread it, I really feel how much his writing style changes when the artists change. So if this feels a little bit simple to you, just know this is only his first form. I'm
excited to see how this goes. I have to kind of get to that point where because I kept on thinking, why people like this? So I need to get to that point to understand that.
No, just imagine, right, that my first exposure to X-Men, like my very first exposure to X-Men is Dark Phoenix Saga. And at that point...
yeah.
Huh?
I was going to say me too, but like not quite, but
not
one of my earliest ones, yeah.
Yeah, so for me, it's more like, at that point, his writing is, I would say, significantly different from this. So when I first picked up my very first, let's not talk about Giant Size X-Men, because it was not written by Claremont, but when I first picked up Classic X-Men #2, and I read it, I was like, that is very different. And and the narrator, like the caption and things like that, it still feels really odd to me, like very what I would define as silver agey, so like you have someone like shouting at you like certain things, and I was like, that's very weird.
That is very true.
But while we're talking about the creative choices here, I do want to highlight the colors a little bit. So the colors here are credited to Petra Goldberg, not a colorist I'm specifically familiar with. And I think it's really interesting because when we read Bronze Age comics, a lot of times you tend to think about the color work as very utilitarian, right? The characters are the colors they are, the world is the colors that, it is. And sometimes it uses some impressionistic, pinks and purples, but it's kind of just like colors are colors. But there's a couple points here that are like really painterly and much more... I don't know how to describe it. Like when they're falling through the air and the ground is below them, it's not just like there's like tree, mountain. It's kind of this like swirl of colors that if you kind of step back from it makes up the ground. But if you get close up on it, feels more like a swirl. It's almost impressionistic in that way. And then later at the end of the issue, the famous Xavier's eyebrows overlaid with the explosion of the plane that Thunderbird is on. It's got this rich purple field, and then the eyebrows fade into the black of the smoke, into the red of the explosion. explosion. And even on the next page, the actual explosion again has the swirl of kind of surreal colors. And I think, this is really beautiful. And this is kind of my argument against things getting recolored in a modern context, because even if the saturation values are a little bit heavier than we would have seen at the time on modern paper or on digital, these are like beautiful, deliberate choices to show fire as a swirl of purple and red and not show like a realistic fire and like brown clouds of smoke, And that's why I love comics from this era, because I love these colors.
It looks really pretty it looks really pretty digitally, by the way. Like, I don't know whether they made any change or anything. But
they did not make any changes. It just looks a little bit, I would say it just looks a little bit more saturated compared to, say, if you have the floppy in newsprint.
Okay.
So, you may see Thunderbird's skin tone as really purplish in some instances. I mean, that's usually, I think, the issue here. Or you probably see an oversaturated red, because I think red turns out very well on newsprint at all. So they have to bump it up.
Not just newsprint, but if you even compare it to like an omnibus or a Marvel Masterwork, I have the third print of the first Uncanny X-Men omnibus in front of me, and I know Tyler, I think, probably either has the second, third, or fourth print behind him. Yeah. And I have it digitally on screen right in front of me. The reds and the pinks, even though they're quite vivid on the glossy paper of the omnibus, are not as bold and red and pink as they are on the digital version. So there's definitely some like absorption to paper aspects happening here.
So, because you brought up color, Peter, and Tyler brought up Thunderbird's skin. So that's not his mutant skin? That's supposed to be his regular skin?
Yeah.
Because that brings up a whole lot of that brings up a lot of can of worms.
You thought he was colored special because he's a mutant this whole time?
Yes.
Wow. Well, that's more of a coloring problem than a you problem. Let's roll into our Thunderbird discussion then.
Because I honestly thought that, that's his mutant. It's part of his mutantness that he's a slightly... Okay, I'm going to stop now. Peter,
but what about the backup story? Like when you get to the classic X-Men backup story, I have a problem with the skin tone there. Because it was really whitewashed.
Yeah, I mean, neither is good.
Well, I know. No. But doesn't that point to you that something is wrong in the coloring instead of a mutant skin color?
Oh, I didn't notice that much. I don't notice this thing. I didn't notice that much because I was actually more interested into the backup story. So I was just kind of flipping through, and then anytime there was like the caption box was different, I was just reading those parts. So, okay. Yeah, I was not doing a side-by-side comparison, which was kind of hard to do with like one iPad. And then Marvel Unlimited is not very kind in terms of having two things. Anyway.
Oops. Well, also I would say that, this is something that it's not isolated to 1975 comics. We talk about it today. People don't always know how to build colors to represent skin tones other than white skin tones. And of course, even in a comic page, white skin tone, I mean, Colossus or Cyclops here is awfully peach colored, certainly a lot more than maybe a white person in reality would be peach colored. I don't know if I'm colored quite as peach as Cyclops is here, but you get people who've never really given a lot of thought to how to represent the color of someone else's racial skin on the page, and you get, I think the Storm's color takes a long time to settle in. And also at the time, they were afraid of putting too much dark color on newsprint because of how much newsprint would soak it up. And so you see, Storm will actually, in these digital versions, look like a little bit almost green because they're afraid to like use black ink to accomplish that. And so the brown of her skin is this, you have to think that ink at this point was just like a CMYK process. And so they're accomplishing that with like a lot of like yellow and blue mixed together to create green rather than like black. Whereas now, things are full on digital, or actually this would have been built with spot colors, but then converted to a CMYK. Anyway, neither here nor there. So now let's talk a little bit about our man Thunderbird here. Does he have to sacrifice himself Why does he sacrifice himself? And let's start letting our appreciation of the backup stories bleed in a little bit here. Do the backup stories help to explain better why he sacrifices?
I think it does. I mean, it changes the perspective of, like, I think without the backup stories and without the additional pages, Thunderbird comes across as trying to overcompensate for something to make up for his own insecurities. But with the added scene that Claremont wrote, as well as the backup story, it seems like, I mean, it added two facets to it. I think one is that it makes him feel, it's more like him feeling useless in the team and trying to contribute, as opposed to him overcompensate because of his own insecurities. So there's a subtle difference here, because here he's trying, I mean, the added scenes make him seem like he's more of a team player trying to contribute, as opposed to just himself, always about him. And then the second thing is just a tiny scene in the backup story where there's a photo of him being in the army, and a comment that he actually joined the army as, younger than he should, because he lied about his age. And that sort of, is there something like a PTSD or something to do with that, or him feeling alienated after seeing the horrors of the war and then coming back to civilian life and not fully adjusting back to, the life that he had before he witnesses all those killings in a war.
And then also to that point, though, is like at that time, at that era, like, non-white American joining American army was not very, like, what's the word for it? Like, they still feel alienated within the army, So the thing is, I was actually thinking more in terms of that because he was honorably discharged, it says, but he was also, like, I think his brother, James, either his brother or Wolverine, one of them says that, we don't know what happened to you at that time. So maybe he was alienated within the team even at that time. And when he's joining this new team and who are more in line with, at least identifies with one part of his identity, he still didn't fit in there. I mean, without that backup issue, this issue of, like, like his sacrifice means very much gets an eye roll. I'm sorry, but it gets an eye roll, and it just feels like, oh, he was just competing with Wolverine and he was trying to show off. But with that backup story, this takes a complete different meaning and is actually makes it a heroic sacrifice rather than just a dumb idea gone wrong.
Yeah, and Claremont, for all of his efforts towards having a diverse cast, sometimes struggles in getting right the cultures that he's trying to portray people being from. And, bless him for giving us this cast that can be, contextually used in modern terms. But sometimes he gets things wrong. And I think we have to hold him to account when he does. And his Thunderbird characterization is pretty much all pride, which works to a degree, right? Like, he has this moment with, Xavier, written by Wein in Giant Size, where he's like, what has the white man kind of ever given to us? Only pain. But Claremont relies really hard on, like, all Indian or indigenous American people need to be prideful. And he kind of goes back to that well repeatedly in the future, maybe with a little nuance that he does here. But I do feel that he kind of takes some responsibility for that and tries to repair it in classic X-Men #3's story, which we're clearly referencing here with his funeral, not only because he kind of reads in that PTSD quality, which I got as well, and all the I think Fariha addressed it so perfectly. I'm not even going to try to say it any better than she did because I can't, but also by introducing his brother, who later becomes Warpath, spoilers, Fariha, and the nuance.
No, I knew that.
Okay. And the nuance of how different he is from Thunderbird, and that he's not the same character. So I think Claremont in this instance actually realizes he made a little bit of a goof the first time around, and he's trying to make something more of it. Before we get to that funeral story,
one
he's going to put one more thing in. Yeah.
Yeah, just one more thing I just want to put, and that's more of a Marvel Universe context, that they did a very good job in terms of, because war is such an integral part, like American war especially is such an integral part in Marvel Universe, especially from Captain America and Punisher. They did actually do a very good job into portraying different races. Experience as U.S. soldier. Like we have Truth, black and white Truth. I think it's that shows like how African American people were treated during World War II, and I think so. It's kind of from that context, because I read a lot of those. It kind of just makes sense that a Thunderbird probably didn't have very good experience even in the army, despite the picture shows him with two of his buddies. It may have had some other connotation behind that.
Maybe we'll have one episode where we get Freya to read several issues of Marvel's famous war comic, The Nom, later on in this series to get her interpretation. Freya likes war comics a lot more than either of the other rest do.
I love it.
DC Comics has this maxi series called Unknown Soldier.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Which I heard was really good. I've never read them because I'm not a fan of war stories. So
it is.
I
can guarantee that. Yeah, I read all of them.
Wow, it goes to show our tastes are actually quite different. So now let's dig into these three backup stories, Classic X-Men 10, 2, and 3. 10 and 2 occur during the training montage in Uncanny X-Men 94. Also, the backup story to number 4 does, but we're going to save that for our next chat because it was actually paired with one of the issues in our next chat.
Yeah.
And then Claremont goes back and uses the backup story in Classic X-Men 10 to insert one of those two. And then finally, Classic X-Men 3 happens directly after this issue. Let's talk about Classic X-Men 10 first, because this is the kind of most straightforward story. It's Wolverine trying to enjoy a beer in New York City, but he's being haunted by the specter and also possibly the reality, we find out at the end, of Sabretooth, who had not quite been introduced yet. We will get there. He's introduced in Iron Fist number 14. Any remarks on this one, or is it just like a nice slice of solo Wolverine?
Well, I think it is the point. Oh, I let Fariha say first. You go first.
No. Only thing I was gonna say, I unfortunately didn't read this. Sorry about that. I forgot my homework. But I read the other ones.
Well, on our schedule, these are marked optional. You are going to have some episodes where one of us decides to take a pass on the optional material. But Tyler, who always brings receipts, has read it and has some commentary.
I mean, this is the point where Sabretooth is still scary. It's still terrifying because he's the one person who can defeat Wolverine and who can kill Wolverine. And this sort of sets up I think this is written after Sabretooth appears. So this is sort of a tradition which will be later established that Wolverine will face Sabretooth once every year, and every year he lose.
Yes.
So that's until they sort of messed up the whole Sabretooth and depowered Sabretooth so much that, that right now he's like, oh, you kill a human, so you're trapped in the pit forever. So...
Well,
that's what I was going to say.
There.
Until Sabretooth has been taken off completely.
So I don't think there's a whole lot more to say. It's a fine story. It does establish Sabretooth's extreme violence and misogyny towards women. Of all the people that he can kill that are kind of wandering around in Wolverine's periphery in this brief story, he kills the one woman who speaks to Wolverine, which is Sabretooth's part of the way he was written as this very misogynist rapist. I mean, that was just kind of part of his characterization, and I'm sure Freya will share lots of opinions with us on that as we get deeper into Sabretooth in the future. So then we also Classic X-Men 2. This is an utterly gorgeous story drawn by John Bolton of Storm and Jean's friendship. It's interesting because Claremont kind of makes a shorthand for their friendship. We see it as early as what we'll talk about next time in Uncanny X-Men 97. It's clearly something Claremont had already planned in his mind, but it doesn't really come through on this page. But here in this story that he inserts, a decade later, it's obvious that Storm and Jean were friends from the beginning, but they go through a little bit of a crucible with each other in this one. Freya, what did you think about this story in Classic X-Men number 2?
Oh, I really loved it. In terms of I've been actually enjoying the classic X-Men, the backup stories more than the actual X-Men so far. And then this one was particularly good because as of right now, those are the two, other than Polaris, I think the two speaking lady X-Men's that
Yes.
X-Men we have seen. And then, they get to do like both, some girly things like shopping, because, that's what we girls like to do all the time. And then at the same time, they also get to fight a mugger and, get have a conversation about personal boundaries, because Jean seems to have taken Professor Xavier's teaching
Speak on it, Fariha.
of intruding into people's mind all the time without asking for permission. Bad Jean, bad. But the one that really stuck out to me, that Misty Knight was her roommate. I love Misty Knight. And then, the whole conversation of she's like, oh, nice name. And, I like your hair. That's something that happened to me. Like, I met someone once, and that was the first thing they said. So that
Great name, great name. Love your hair.
Yeah, that made me laugh so much. And then also, talking about, we talked about it before as well, that how Storm feels about what modern, Western society calls decency, or what is that word they use? That she's very quick to take off her clothes.
Modesty.
Kind of
the lack of modesty.
Modesty or lack thereof, or maybe definition of it. She's like, yeah, you cannot be here in your costume. She's like, okay, and then the costume goes off, and it's like, wow.
The thing I enjoy about it is, I think,
very funny.
In some fantasy contexts, if you're writing that character, they're almost written as dumb, it's written naive, but also as a lack of understanding, oh no, you can't be naked here, and they have this very kind of Adam and Eve naivete about why would I cover this, but that comes from not understanding. But I think with Storm, I get that it's rooted in certain assumptions that Claremont is making about the cultures that she comes from and where she came from in Kenya, and we could probably dig into that. But at the same time, I don't think he's ever writing it as Storm not getting it. It's almost that Storm doesn't care. She's like, how offended are you going to be? This is my culture. This is who I am. And I don't really care about your clothes, which I think is just a more interesting beat to write, even if it still has a lot of assumptions baked into it. I think it's an interesting beat to write, rather than some character who's naked. Why does that? I don't know. Am I trying to give Claremont too much credit? Is it really the same thing, or is there a subtle line there?
To be honest, I don't know. I read Murders 13 recently. I know that Storm, so I don't know whether that's informing this Storm. You know what I mean? If this is the first time I was reading it, which version version of the narrative I would pick? Just, is it because I know who Storm is, and that the fact that she's not a dummy, that I'm reading it this way?
Right, which could be the same for me too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is written after Claremont has wrote Storm for 10 years.
And I think she's the character with the most speech bubbles in his run at this point. So he's written a lot of Storm.
Yep.
The other thing that I get though,
so
because
in that case, who knows?
The other thing that I got from Fariha, though, about, here's these two women doing the thing they like, shopping, right? But they're not just talking about men. They're not just talking about Cyclops or Colossus or Wolverine. And it's only very briefly at the beginning here where Storm is the only woman on the team. Very quickly, we get Jean back on the team, starting with issue 98. And it kind of, as we go on, there's never really a time where we're down to just one woman on the team ever again. And Claremont never just has them there as people's accessories. And so I almost, again, because I know Claremont loves to be a revisionist, I almost see them as him rereading his early issues and being like, I shouldn't have let Jean leave so soon. I should have kept Jean so there it wouldn't just be Storm. And this is him trying to repair that by giving Jean and Storm this really great, as they say in theater, four-hander, where it's just two people interacting for the entire time.
I think I read an interview where Claremont mentioned that the reason why Jean left was because those issues were plotted before he came on officially.
Okay.
So both him and Cockrum really like Jean, and they would like to bring her back, which was why, almost immediately she's back with the team. But if I remember correctly, but
that sounds familiar to me too. Again, we are not historians like some of these other X-Men podcasts that you could go and listen to, but we will occasionally know historical things.
But like the thing about John Bolton's art here is that look at the facial expression, look at the body language. It is so good here, and he can do them in like civilian wear. He can do them in costume, and I don't know. I mean, I just really enjoy it. It's so it looks so simple, but yet it is so good.
He's very efficient with his line work. Let's now move on. And also we get a hint of Storm's claustrophobia here, but I mean, Claremont inserts that in every possible
everyone
he gets. So I don't think we have to talk about it every time. Let's go to the kind of marquee event here. We've mentioned it many times. It is the backup that is in Classic X-Men number 3, which is Thunderbird's funeral. And again, Jean just turns up because Claremont's trying to get her back into things, right? This has so much good material in it. I would say that this is like absolute required reading if you're going to read Claremont. I don't care if you just have to go out and buy this one single issue or read it on Marvel Unlimited or whatever. As much as we've enjoyed the other ones, to me, I've never read this issue before, and I was just stunned by this story. Just absolutely stunned. I don't know, Fariha, what did you think about this?
No, I mean, we talked about it just now. It's like without this issue, the entire arc, like very short living arc of Thunderbird makes no sense, or like makes it just really a terrible characterization, versus with this, a lot more nuances is added to him. And then also like, that there is like just not going to be one Native American character, but there are more coming. It's like also shows that a little bit. And then, I mean, I also kind of liked that we also begin to see that Wolverine's a soft aspect of him, that, he was like always fighting with Thunderbird, but now he's kind of feeling a little bit more guilt towards it, which kind of becomes his trademark as we go along. But then, and at the same time, that all the team members had some moments that they thought back about their time with Thunderbird, and which kind of is a question. And okay, they've been actually together for longer than just 2 issues, which feels like a couple of days versus more.
Right, because per the training montage in 94, it had been weeks and weeks, or even as suggested by some other material, maybe even several months. And I think you bring up a great point about Wolverine. This is the kind of honorable Wolverine that Claremont starts to write late, kind of in the 160s and 170s. He's kind of just seen as this constant warrior for so long, but this is a later version of Wolverine that really has honor and relies on his kind of code of honor, and that's kind of like post. Wolverine limited series with Frank Miller, in my opinion. And then also Banshee, who like feels some genuine anguish for not being able to stop Thunderbird. Banshee, I think Claremont never quite gets a grip on. I guess we'll continue to look into that as we continue reading. So it's nice to have like a real moment of emotion from Banshee. And then the final thing that really stuck out to me is Thunderbird says, are we going to dude up in these skin tights and punch heads for Xavier for the rest of our lives? And if we do, how long will those lives last? Which, of course, ties really closely to what Fariha talked about earlier with his PTSD and his kind of feeling that, not everybody comes back from these missions. I thought that was a really powerful panel. Even though it was a really funny panel, it actually was pretty powerful, too.
I am going to, it's my life's mission now to use dude up.
Dude up. Let's get duded up.
In just a normal day-to-day conversation. I'm not going to set it up. I'm just going to normally use it. Just have to, this is my life's mission now. Dude up.
So Tyler, any parting thoughts on this one?
This story has so many small, intimate moments between characters, and like especially of course with Thunderbird, that is like I don't know. I mean, I really enjoy it. Like the fact that they touch upon Storm not choosing the room given to her and moved to an attic and then filled it up with with flowers, because she's in touch with nature. That does not come on until quite late. I mean, not quite, but sometime later where we are shown that. And then there is this little conversation between Storm and Kurt about religion and beliefs regarding a dead body, which I thought was pretty on point as well. So these are the things that I would like to add to, what both of you said so well earlier.
And then also like so far, I haven't seen Kurt being religious yet. So this was the first time like, oh, this is where it begins. To be honest, though, guys, when you guys talked about the characterization or the team building that Claremont has done, to me, all of that happened in classic X-Men. As of right now, I am not seeing it in Uncanny X-Men. And that's one of the reasons I'm just really like, oh, why?
I say to people all the time when they're like, oh, I'm going to start Claremont from the beginning. I'm like, here's the thing. Claremont is not necessarily great or infallible from the beginning. And we're seeing literally a writer of a decade of additional experience getting compared to his original work here. And it's just noticeable. For me, Claremont doesn't get super consistent until the 50s or 150s or 160s, which is a long way from now. We're going to read some clunkers as we go along, but it'll be really interesting because it's encouraging to me how much you love the classic X-Men issues, because to me, reading those, that's Claremont. This classic X-Men #3 backup story is, in my mind, what Claremont sounds like. So if you love that, eventually we're going to get to a point where you're loving this.
And I think you will love his New Mutants, because I think these backup stories are very in line with the tone and the stuff that he does with New Mutants.
Excellent. So Fariha, are you still with us? Do we have you hooked? Are you going to come back for another X-Men reread?
No, I mean, we always talk about it, that X-Men are best together. And this is proving that again and again. Like, if I was reading it by myself, I would have given up by now. Well, maybe not. Maybe if I was reading classic X-Men. But because we're reading it together and I'm learning so much, of course, I'm like super excited to see where this is going. And I'm like, because I trust both of your choices. So I'm like, this cannot be the thing that Peter and Tyler likes. There has to be something more to this. Because if not, I'll have to reevaluate my friendship. Our friendship is
I'm not looking to get canceled over any Bronze Age comic books, so I promise it's going to get good.
I was just kidding, but that's one of the reasons I'm excited to read on and then see where this goes.
Excellent. Well, we're going to be back with yet another episode of us doing our epic X-Men reread. We're going to read, if you want to get ready to read along with us, Uncanny X-Men issues number 96 and 97, and Classic X-Men backups issues 4 and 5. So until then, thank you so much for joining us here on Crushing Comics, and so much for going through this classic Claremont reread. Everybody take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.